this would be for you too. And I found this really fascinating. In your report, you said we find that immigrants who learned a foreign language as children had the lowest average scores on literacy and numeracy. However, the scores of U.S.-born adults who learned a foreign language approximated the scores of their English-only U.S.-born. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Like, why do you think the difference is?
Well, I think the main difference is that we are testing English language, right? So it's kind of expected that those who learn the foreign language, it will take time to learn English to a sufficient level. But I think that with this, one of the questions we really wanted to understand is that is there a kind of an inherent immigrant disadvantage that serves as a long-term barrier? And the results that look at intergenerational progress, or the results that show intergenerational progress, as well as the fact that if you are born in the U.S. and even if you learn a foreign language first and then English, it's not really a long-term detriment. I think it's a good finding for the immigrant integration, from the immigrant integration point of view.
Great. Yes, it supports policies around dual language learning, I think, which are very much being contested, but being more broadly accepted than they have been historically. So
You'd say.
I'm predictable.
You're right. All right, so let's open it up to other questions.
It's not a question. It's some thoughts in response to Sharabi's question about, okay, so how can we affect practitioners? And so I have three thoughts. One is there is, and actually this first idea comes from my colleague Margaret here, there is a wonderful way to reach practitioners through something called LINKS, the Literacy Information and Communication System, that several people here have been directly involved with. And there are several different communities of practice. One, for example, in health, that would be health literacy specifically. They would be very interested in some of the health findings from the PIAAC research. The technology and literacy certainly would be interested in the PSTRE findings and so forth. A second is, this is perhaps a little less conventional, but I think very important. There's a publication that has really affected a lot of teachers and learners in the field. It's called The Change Agent. And many of the articles are written by learners, many by practitioners and others. I think it's a great way to get research to the field. And the third is an example, just one example. There may be others of this. Many years ago, the National Center for the Study of Adult Learning and Literacy at Harvard and World Education did some research on the GED and published the findings. And a practitioner, a teacher in Boston actually, took that and wrote up an interesting series of lesson plans for GED students to study the GED and its effect on their own lifelong earnings, which led them to conclude that they better go on to post-secondary education, as you all know. But it's having those tools right in your hand as a teacher that you can take into your class tomorrow or next week that makes all the difference in getting the research into practice for teachers and for adult learners.
Thank you.
Great comments, thank you.
I'm Vivika Halapuu from Estonian Ministry of Education and Research, and I have one remark and one question. The remark stemmed from Michael Fix's presentation, and it actually reflects on something that Surabi said. Namely, when you began, you said that you excluded those 14% of people who didn't solve or who didn't have a problem-solving score. And it has been in my head for the whole day already that maybe we should not, or in this case it was like methodologically justified, but maybe we should not really exclude them all the time, but we should rather go into this group and see why didn't they have this, why didn't they have the, what were those terms that Steve used before. But this is just a comment that maybe we should actually study what is the reason, how during the next PIAAC we could get those people to solve those tasks so that we could actually use the data for them as well. But my question was about those factors that you used for controlling the wage gap. And I'm just finalizing my own report on wage gap in Estonia, and I'm doing it on both ethnic and language wage gap, and gender wage gap. And what my results show that language skills are what actually diminish it. And the other aspect, I think, what should be important in Canada should be perhaps region. But then again, in PIAAC data, you might not have this data.
Sorry, can you repeat the last part about what's important in Canada?
I think the region, can it be that, for example, most of the wage gap comes from Saskatchewan, for example, or something like this? So maybe.
Okay. Thank you.
Some ideas.
Yes, I think your comment is actually right on as far as what we're missing. We talked at our table earlier, since immigrants are kind of disproportionately out of this problem solving, we also are missing them as far as, do they have jobs, are they contributing to the economy? We're missing them in a lot of things. And unfortunately, like you talked about methodologically, that was kind of essential because I would have such a small sample size. But I definitely think that that the dependent variable drives a lot of what we can do as researchers, and so sometimes we need to be very cautious about what dependent variable we're using. A lot of us today used wage. It means that everybody who doesn't have a wage wasn't included. And really that sometimes is the most interesting group, and so that we should maybe be paying more attention to, especially with these literacy interventions. So Canada, I think, is very interesting because I do think there's regional variation there. And I haven't looked at that yet. It's also been suggested I look at English versus French Canadians, because one thing, also speaking a little bit to the U.S. immigration, for those of you that aren't familiar, PIAAC in Canada was actually offered you could take it in French or in English. And part of that was their overrepresentation of the French population. But it was only offered in English in the U.S., which meant that about 98.5% of individuals that took it in Canada were taking it in their native language, and about 91% in the U.S. And that obviously will be shrinking if we continue to maintain a U.S.-only approach to PIAAC in the U.S. So regionally and then also language-wise, I think there's going to be some differences there, and that's something I need to look at in the future. But thank you.
Mine was a comment, too, rather than a question, and it was in response to William's paper and the questions you posed at the end about what's behind the wage gap for well-educated immigrants in Canada. And just before coming here, I was reading a number of chapter drafts from scholars writing in Canada about transnational migration in Canada and observing this pattern. And really, what they're observing, and they're working with practitioners and programs, suggests that the underemployment is a major factor, and also the last variable, the inequality that may be explained by discrimination, is also a problem, in that people come with these credentials after being given access because of the point system, but then they don't have access to those jobs because their credentials are from outside of the country and not valued, so they can't be hired into the jobs. We have this phenomenon in the U.S. too, so people take jobs in maybe the same industry, maybe not, but at occupations far lower than those that they were prepared to do in their home countries. So that would explain some part of that at least. And then what are the factors that cause them to do that? Yeah. Other questions that our data may not be able to tell us. There's some, back to that, what are the unobserved variables that generate some of the inequality we see?
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for the comments. I think you're basically right on where there's maybe a loose coupling or not a very strong connection between a policy that's bringing in highly educated immigrants, which does place value on their educational credential, and then once they get into the country, that educational credential is undervalued. And so perhaps this means that we need to have better communication and relationships between what's going on at the policy level and what really, I was talked about before, we don't have any employers here. So the employers and the policymakers getting together and saying, hey, what does this credential really mean? And then supporting them once they get in country to make sure they're not underemployed. So thank you.
Can I say a word? Can I say a word? Yeah, we've done some separate research on underemployment of immigrants who entered after they were 25 with a degree earned abroad. And what we find is that underemployment is highly concentrated by region. In other words, it's much higher for immigrants coming from Latin America, and it's much higher for immigrants coming from Africa than it is for immigrants coming from Asia and from Europe. And in part of the explanation of this is that many of those more highly educated immigrants coming in are not employer-sponsored. Many Africans, for example, come on diversity visas to the United States, and the lack of employer sponsorship is somewhat is correlated to some extent with underemployment.
Kind of sitting back here in the wonk corner, so I'm going with Jeff Carter and Steve Reeder. So I'm going to ask if you would be willing to talk a little bit about what you were going to say about the ACS data as opposed to the PIAAC data. Very interesting. Can you summarize that?
So we were very interested to know whether PIAAC data is, as great as it is, would be an amazing resource for everyone who studies immigration, or immigrants in the United States, and how well they're doing. And before PIAAC came along, we typically use either the American Community Survey or the Current Population Survey, the two large-scale federal population surveys conducted by the U.S. Census Bureau. So we looked at the distribution of immigrants and natives across a variety of characteristics in PIAAC versus ACS and in PIAAC versus CPS. And what we found was that, so for the most part, in terms of like basic demographics such as age and gender and race and ethnicity, the percentages for both, well, we were primarily interested in immigrants, but in general for immigrants and natives were similar between these two pairs of surveys. However, on some characteristics, the surveys were different. So for instance, PIAAC participants were slightly less likely to be foreign-born and less likely to arrive since 2000. And on the other hand, they were more likely to have graduate degree and to be employed. So the selection and who was selected to participate as well as who was excluded for a variety of reasons did play a role. So we concluded that the PIAAC likely overstates skill levels of U.S. immigrant population.
And that was okay because the skill gaps are so large in our findings that just makes the findings be more conservative.
My question is about variation within immigrants. Are there any immigrant groups that are doing better than others? And the reason why I'm asking the question is, so far we've been talking about what you know, but maybe it's part of maybe the unknown explanatory factors is who you know, who knows you. Does that explain some of the variation in terms of education and employment?
Well, at least in terms of education, again, our institute has been looking at the issues of brain waste and skill underutilization among college-educated immigrants for a long time. And we were, of course, interested to, first of all, assess with PIAAC data how many of college-educated immigrants obtain degrees in the United States. And we find that a significant share, 59%, obtain degrees in the United States, which is a good story, good news for them as well as for the country. And so they are doing as well as the U.S. educated native-borns. So that's one population that is doing very well, which has implications, as we talk about the reform. And one of the aspects is which groups of people to prioritize. Perhaps this is one of the findings that can be discussed based on PIAAC data. what we also found that in the there is great variation in skills by race. So the immigrants, how white or white immigrants were very similar to their native-born counterparts. So some groups there is definitely racial and ethnic differences that we observe. So some groups are doing much better, even just even though the test is in English. Interestingly enough, we didn't find much difference by gender in terms of immigrants and natives. Immigrant women were scoring on average similar to native-born immigrant men, and the same was true for the native population.
Yeah, our major finding is what you can do with PIAAC is obviously do regional analyses. You can't do country analyses, and so our findings are by race and ethnicity and by nativity. And so there you can really see some what the striking pattern is, the progress from the immigrant generation for Hispanics to the U.S.-born Hispanics, and you see similar patterns around the Asian population. Where you don't see a change much is in the black population, the black immigrant population, and the black native population. You don't see this why. It's because the native black population confronts so many barriers.
So, and regarding, I think your comment on it might be kind of who you know as part of the undocumented explanations. We talked a little bit about that before in the social networking piece, and I think there's been some past research that looked at really the networking of immigrants in the U.S. being somewhat constricted, partially because of language barriers and partially because of document status. And I think that constricted network can also affect your social capital and how likely you are able to get into some of these higher wage occupations.
Great. Yes.
This probably is a question, though it hits a little differently for the two papers. But did you consider variation around language? Even though in the U.S. The assessments were in English only, as Jean said, individuals could take the background questionnaire in English or Spanish. That was a choice. And in Canada, they could take the background interview in either language as well as the assessment in either official language. So I'm just, you mentioned some results, Michael, about, and Jean, about English, self-rated English language ability. Right. But I don't think, did you look at language choice as far as the background questionnaire?
No.
But that's definitely a great variable to explore, because even though the literacy is in English, those who took Spanish, who took background in Spanish will be very, very different, and perhaps looking at even in the intersection of that variable and nativity might give interesting results. So thank you. We didn't even think about it.